Hi everybody. I wanted to start out this week's video series just going over some of the readings that we had about aging brains in This Chair Rocks. So this is from chapter 3, Older Brains, and she really covers a lot of great things. And in their second lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the main truths of what is intelligence, what is cognitive functioning, how do we define it, is it really declining in age, what kind of patterns do we see, and we're going to look a little bit more deeply into how different types of measurements of cognitive functioning look across aging, like wisdom. So that's the second part, but in this one, we're really contrasting to the truth of cognitive decline versus what this ageist narrative of the fear of forgetting and fear of cognitive decline has led us to believe about cognition and aging. So let's keep going here. So what is the truth? About what is true about cognitive decline as we age? There's a lot of fears, information, true or false, out there about what it actually is. And she sort of starts out the chapter by saying, serious mental decline is not a normal or inevitable part of aging, because this is a myth that I think most people buy into, and this has created a very intense fear in our society that's sustained by this ageist belief that, these little things of forgetting somehow are going to end up with Alzheimer's or another type of dementia and in a nursing home and unable to, converse or be able to, recognize ourselves. So we kind of take this this reality and then distort it and blow it up and become afraid of it so much that somehow we think cognitive decline is much more pervasive than it actually is, and that it affects more people, it affects more functions, when actually there's some truths out there that need to be clarified. So if this is not true, that everybody's going to decline and that Alzheimer's is going to happen to everybody or everybody's going to get dementia, then what is true? And as I mentioned, we'll talk about some of this in our second lecture when we do talk about classic patterns of cognitive functioning and aging. But we really do want to get a little bit into what is the truth, which she talks about in her book as well. So the truth is, and this is cited in several large studies, so we take large groups of adults and follow them across time, and we look at their cognitive functioning and health and all kinds of other factors. Those types of big studies are what we're talking about here, which is basically the best data you can get. So the truth is, and one of the truths that she reports from the MacArthur Foundation study of successful aging, is that declines rarely affect all of cognitive performance. So normal age-related declines are not this wholesale, my brain's gone kind of thing, like just took an eraser and just pretty much as I age, just keep erasing and erasing. That's not true. Normal aging, as you can see here in this trajectory, everyone has some slight cognitive changes. So 80% of people are going to have slight cognitive changes during aging. Some a little more so than others, as you can see with this green line. But really, only a small percentage of people are experiencing either what we would call mild cognitive impairment, which is that sort of first area of significant decline, and then into the dementia, we have even fewer people experiencing actual dementia, which Alzheimer's is a type. So really, there's not a lot of people in these categories. Certainly, it is a huge disease. It is an epidemic. But when we look at 100% of older adults, certainly not even close to there, much, much lower. In fact, only 10 to 20% of people over 65 will even experience mild cognitive impairment. And of those, some people may progress onto these more serious dementia-like features, mild, moderate, moderately severe dementia, including Alzheimer's. But most people are going to be in this preclinical, not even really, don't even think of it as preclinical, but just a phase before mild cognitive impairment. And 20% of people in their 90s escape decline entirely. So, the truth is that it's not as pervasive and it's not as prevalent as we think it is. Unfortunately, we have this thing called ageism in our society that we've been hitting on a lot. That inflates the reality. She mentions Margaret Gillette in her book, who terms this the irrational fear of forgetting. And they found in a 2010 MetLife study that cancer is the number one fear, and then Alzheimer's is the number two fear, which is interesting because when you look at the prevalence of cancer versus the prevalence, or how much Alzheimer's versus how much cancer is out there, much less Alzheimer's out there than there is cancer, but very, very huge fear. So even those little senior moments, which we'll talk about, people start to worry about this inevitable decline narrative. And there's a huge stigma around forgetting and mental incompetence. And they talk about this in chapter 3 about how this really drives it, is that our mental selves, our sense of self, our cognitive functioning, our mental acuity is highly prized in our society. That's something that we see as very important. And the stigma comes from when we see that threatened, right? So I'm losing my sense of self, I'm losing my memory, I'm losing my mind, right? Those types of things are huge fears. So the stigma kind of bubbles around these normal cognitive changes that are happening in people, like, oh my goodness, I'm losing my mind. But in reality, you're not losing your mind. And your mind, as we will see, adapts in a lot of ways. But we have a lot of decline myths, right? So myths of cognitive decline that we talked about, this irrational fear of forgetting, they fuel a lot of things like worker discrimination in older adults, so incompetence, so any sign of any decline, well, you can't work, you can't do this, paternalistic takeover of rights, right? So we assume that older people are going to lose their cognitive capacities. This leads to a lot of paternalistic takeover of rights, things like taking over your finances, taking over your estate, taking over your care, because we think that they're incompetent. Also, it has a lot of social implications. When we think about the implications of this in society, all we have to do is look at senior moments, right? So people talk about this all the time, and we have this nice comic here, which you've probably seen a lot of her, but we make a lot of fun of having these moments of forgetfulness. And when I think it's interesting in the book, she says, well, when I was 20 years old and I had these similar types of forgetting, like I'd forget where my keys were, I'd forget where I put my books, I didn't freak out and think, oh my God, I have dementia, or I'm having a senior moment, or I'm having a junior moment. But somehow we overlap this onto age, and everybody goes crazy, when they think that they're forgetting or they're starting to lose their mind, right? So we get a lot of our stigma and our problems from there. Okay. And I think that the issue that we really need to think about when we think about how we've inflated this issue of cognitive decline is that it does lead to some detrimental effects. Worker discrimination, taking over older adults' rights when they needn't be, but also the stigma of having dementia is, in and of itself, can lead to things like anxiety and depression, lower self-esteem, feelings of shame and humiliation. So this is direct results of all of these things, of steering away from the truth and inflating it to this huge problem, and then assuming that because there is a cognitive decline, that somehow sense of self is gone and that this person is not worth things, and it is a shameful condition, which is not true. There's no shame in having these things. They're just very different than experiences from before. So when we look at what we can do, so about cognitive decline, so the truth is that there are normal age-related declines, and that some people will experience more declines in a small amount of areas if they have some kind of mild cognitive impairment, and that's even a challenged diagnosis, right? Because it sort of breeds fear, this no man's land in between dementia and normal cognitive declines that we have just as a result of aging for 80% of us. There are things that we can do. So what is the real prevention? We want to talk about the truth in prevention as well, because we have a lot of these brain fitness myths that are out there as well, and all of these brain games. And Lumosity actually had a lawsuit filed, and a class action, lawsuit against it, in which they lost, or at least settled, because the claims that they were making about their brain game were found to be untrue. And in general, there's a lot of research out there if you're interested in how brain games, like a Lumosity or like something you can download on an app, are or are not efficacious. And then most times we find that they're not really that helpful. But there are things that we can do to really prevent, the truth of prevention of more than normal cognitive decline. So a lot of what this chapter talked about were things like neurogenesis and building your cognitive reserve. Pardon the typo there. In neurogenesis, it was thought that you couldn't regrow brain cells, or that you couldn't have new circuitry happening. But we're finding from a large body of research that that's just not the case. There's lots of neurogenesis happening across the lifetime, including in older age. Some really fascinating studies on groups like cabbies and nuns, and looking at how continuing to challenge your brain, and not just by playing a game, but by doing daily tasks and having social connectivity and physical activity and self-efficacy really can help build new circuitry, new neurons, and can help you build up this cognitive reserve. So, the more that you do some of those things, the more reserve that you build over time. Even if you do experience those plaques and tangles that are characteristic of Alzheimer's type dementia, you may not show symptoms ever in your life. There's some fantastic studies on nuns and post-mortem autopsies of their brains, looking at the fact that they look like they should have Alzheimer's. And this is not just nuns, but that's a particular study. But they don't, because they built up so much cognitive reserve over their lifetimes by doing some of these preventative measures, that the threats to their brain don't cause the same types of symptoms, because they have so much what we call reserve. So that's the basic idea. I know it's a lot more scientific than that, but certainly that idea of neurogenesis and cognitive reserve are real preventative measures. There's also research to support cognitive rehabilitation, which is sort of the closest we have to brain fitness games. Cognitive rehab is a therapeutic tool used in neurology, neuropsychology, rehabilitation programs to help you get back a little bit of your cognitive functioning. So maybe if you're having some memory problems, they can do a systematic set of training exercises and adaptations that have been proven to be useful, at least most of the time in the shorter long term. But we don't have a lot of robust evidence that over several years that you're going to keep these gains if you no longer are participating in some of the activities or adaptive practices. So what are some of the main things that are helpful? As I mentioned, and as the book mentioned, challenge your brain. And that doesn't mean by just playing a game. It means by doing things like daily activities, that learning a new language, learning a new instrument, doing things like ballroom dance or board games and things like that continuously, though, not just 5 minutes here or there, but something that you've put in as a lifestyle change. And maintaining your social fitness, right? So they found that social connectivity is actually very protective and help building cognitive reserve. And exercise or physical activity, of course, very useful. And the last one that they mentioned, which was interesting, they talked about a few studies, was self-efficacy. So if you believe in yourself, believe that you can do it, believe that you can function, believe that you have the ability to turn this around and to be able to engage in things, you're much more likely to build your reserve and have neurogenesis and new circuitry than if you don't. And if you have more of a negative or self-defeating and have lower confidence in your abilities. So, your mind, not just the circuitry of your brain, but the mind has a big effect. So as a psychologist, I'm glad to see that, because things like social connectivity, self-efficacy, that's our bread and butter. All right. So the book mentioned this too, but it's interesting that age in and of itself, it does come with some cognitive declines, but it also comes with some cognitive growth in some interesting areas. So we find that as we age, we're better able to deal and adapt with negative emotions. We have a more mature emotional brain than we did when we were younger, and that includes higher levels of well-being, which they talked about in the U curve of happiness, which I won't really go into much in this lecture. They also talked about that attention seems to widen, and you seem to be able to have more use of a wider sort of spotlight for your attention. So you're able to pay a little bit more attention to some more details, but also in that your filter is better. So you can take in more, but you have a better filter to be able to say, that's superfluous, that information isn't important, that probably is. So it's more useful at heading off things like misjudgments and navigating highly complex situations. And this could be a sort of that overlap between experience, right? So wisdom, experience that I'll talk about in the next lecture, but also some changes in your adaptability of circuitry in your brain. All right. And they gave a couple of nice examples of park ranger, Stuart Atkins, who are better able to have selective attention. So that attention piece they did illustrate in the chapter. They did talk a couple of times about creativity too in our brains. So there's a couple of different things here. They talked about Gene Cohen in his book, The Mature Mind. In this talking about there are these psychological developments that happen later in life that are these untapped wells of creativity, this intellectual potential that we have. So you see here in this schematic, which is sort of looking at the way Erickson looked at life, you reevaluate your life at midlife. You have this liberation. You say, if not now, when am I going to do that? So you're sort of summing up the things that you've done, looking at unfinished business, overcoming fears, again, that emotional maturity, and you have this encore part of life later on. So illustrated here as well, when we look at, in our 20s, we may be highly productive, doing research and getting results, 40s, understanding our own potential and being able to look at that, and then in our 60s, we're coming back to this sort of willing to challenge things, willing to look at things in a new and different way and be more creative in our thinking. And this is cognitive growth and creativity. Creativity and imagination, she also talked about in this chapter, are a big part of understanding untapped strengths of people who may have other cognitive declines, like people with Alzheimer's or dementia. So imagination and creativity, and some of the examples that she gave of caregivers and their loved ones with dementia, and how they learned to look at these creative strengths that their loved ones had, and really, instead of looking at it as a loss of self and a loss of memory and a loss of cognitive decline, they could look at it from a strengths-based perspective and say, well, they're developing a lot of things too in this more creative realm and able to respond more creatively in some ways. And we talked about Glenn Campbell as an example of someone who continued to be creative into later life. He was a singer-songwriter. And there are lots of examples of creativity and growth. Some of the articles, the short articles that I had you read were about that, but some of it was also about how cultivating creativity and engaging in creative endeavors really does help build this reserve and in a lot of ways neurogenesis. So creativity is both sort of an untapped potential in later life, but also can help sort of build our cognitive reserve and cognitive ability to have cognitive growth in later life as well. And one of the articles about summing up some of the creativity interventions on cognition, we'll talk a lot about that. So the bottom line that we want to think about when we talk about decline and cognitive decline and aging is that we really just need to seek the truth. And this is kind of the bottom line in a lot of these is, we need to look at cognitive decline and the narrative that we've built around cognitive decline in the US in particular, but in a lot of industrialized countries, is that aging isn't an inevitable, serious mental breakdown, that we need to actually look at what the truth is behind this and what are the facts of cognitive decline and step it back. As a lot of you mentioned in your ageism assignments, just a awareness and understanding of the reality is what maybe needs to happen for a lot of people to understand that and to help this irrational fear of forgetting and becoming inevitably demented is going to help. So a lot of the things that she talked about in the book too is to focus on when we think about decline and a decline narrative. Certainly there will be people who experience significant decline and have Alzheimer's, but that does not mean that that's a lost cause or that there is no quality life there, or there aren't any mental capacities. We talked about creativity. We talked about how understanding the strengths and meeting someone who has some decline at the strengths where they're at, which is kind of, if you're familiar with the Montessori method of teaching, it's similar to that. And we have some Montessori type interventions for individuals with Alzheimer's, really meet them where they are. So instead of looking at them as a lost cause and less than human, we need to start looking at symptoms as, instead of a list of cognitive symptoms, people as what their strengths are, how we can meet them there, and how we can develop those strengths. Ending with the fact that dementia does not claim older people. It does not take them. It is not a loss of the person necessarily, in looking at it as more of altering the way in which they now live their lives and not a loss of a total self. And she has a great line that says, just remember that the disease is bigger. The disease is not bigger than the person. The disease does not overtake the person. The person is still there with a disease or set of symptoms. So the personhood, the self, is still there. All right, so that's that chapter, and then, we'll have a second lecture video that you can view this week too, to talk more about the nuts and bolts of cognition, how we define it, and if we are declining, in what ways and in what ways not, and how maybe alternative viewpoints of cognition such as wisdom play into it. All right, so I'll see you in the next video.